I live in the darkness, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. There is some speculation that people can be born this way, just like there are morning people, there are night people. Something about their bodies keeping them awake at night and sending them to sleep when the sun rises. I've always been like this. My mother calls me her little night owl. I prefer to think of myself as nocturnal. As you can imagine, this has made school and life in general rather difficult. It was always a struggle when I was younger. I could never force myself to sleep at night and would go to school exhausted the next day. The bags nature had placed under my eyes stood out even more dramatically to the tune of my exhaustion. By the time I reached high school, I had trained myself to live on little to no sleep. I would go to school in the morning, struggle until 3 o'clock rolled around, and then run off home to sleep until 6 or 7 at night. All in all, I'd get 3 to 4 hours of sleep a day. It was painful getting used to it, and I've heard that sleep deprivation has awful effects on people. But, as my father would say, it is what it is. There is no use fighting one's nature, and society is just as unforgiving. So, yes, I am naturally nocturnal. My nights are spent tucked away in my room, watching TV or surfing the internet. I've never questioned it much, but lately, I've come to think that maybe, just maybe, my nightly insomnia has something to do with the farm. The farm. That's where I was born and raised. My mother gave birth to me in the bathroom during a blizzard. The EMTs could not get out and there was no getting to the hospital, not with the driveway hidden beneath 6 feet of snow. The first thing I ever saw was the naked bulb swinging from the ceiling, illuminating the harsh white of the porcelain tub. At least, that's what I imagine. Because since the time of my birth, that place has always seemed so cold. It's only natural, I think. Anyway, there isn't much to the farm, really. It's 300 acres, sure, but we rent the land out for the other farmers in the area. My father was a businessman. My mother was a librarian. They didn't care much for farm life, but the farm had been in my father's family for generations, and there's no way he would sell, not on his life. That's just the way he is. Actually, my father is just like I am. I inherited my nightmare prowling from him. Everyone else in my family, mother, sister, brother, are all morning people. It's a special kind of hell for someone like me to be born into a family of morning people. But my father, at least, understood me. When I was very young and couldn't sleep, he'd stay up and watch cartoons with me all night. Samurai Jack was our favorite. It was one of those sweet memories that made the farm seem warmer somehow. People wondered why I went so far away for college. It's a small town and people talk, of course. And it wasn't like I hated my parents or anything. Despite their insistence on strange names and private education for us kids, on the contrary, I loved them more than life itself. So why did I move thousands of miles away when my perfect family was right there in front of me? Would you laugh if I told you it was because of that farm? It was that coldness, I swear. No matter how warm my family life was, that fucking place was like ice. When I was a child, I often had the feeling that this was where animals came to die. It made sense, since the farmers in the area made use of our barn as a slaughterhouse. But it was even something beyond that. It seemed like the very earth itself was frozen solid. Perhaps by nature. Perhaps by something else. So I did what I had to, and I moved away. Just like that. My parents didn't mind. They were actually excited that I had left our little one-horse town. They thought I might make something of myself. At least, my mom did. When they congratulated me on getting accepted to university, I saw something strange in my father's eyes. I wonder what it was. You must be wondering, what's the point of me telling you all this? What does it matter, and how does it concern you? You see, my father has become sick. He has become very, very sick. He is no longer able to oversee our land as he once did. And my mother, always having been in frail health, is not up to the task. My brother and sister, both older than I am, live nearby. Perhaps it's logical that the task fall upon me, but there is one little thing that I haven't told you yet. My insomnia is my nature. I accept this. But maybe, just maybe, it has to do with the dream. It's been a long, long time since I had the dream, so I had forgotten all about it until my father called just last night. It didn't seem all that important at the time. After all, we all have one or two nightmares we remember vividly from our childhood. This is reality. This is not something to concern oneself with. But this one was different. I was 12 and very sick. It was a particularly bad bout of strep, one that landed me in the hospital just a few days later. Because of that, I had been sleeping fitfully, regardless of the time, passing my days in an array of feverish dreams. I only remember one. It was night. I'd opened my eyes to find myself in my little cot, the wrought iron of the bed frame cold to my touch. Or perhaps it only felt that way because I was so hot. My throat was screaming in pain, and, despite my better judgment, I was drawn to the idea of water. It would be painful at first, but maybe it would help? My feet touched the icy floorboards as I crept into the hallway down the stairs. I reached the ground floor and wandered into the living room, wondering if my father might still be awake. I began to shiver, my arms wrapped around me like a blanket. I let out a rancid breath and was greeted with white fog. It was freezing. Now, I may live in Minnesota, but August isn't that cold. In fact, August is usually quite hot. I stood there for a moment in the living room, staring at the frost on the walls, wondering what the hell was going on. Or maybe I was going insane? Suddenly, I began to walk. I crept out the back door, my feet carried me by instinct even further into the cold. It felt like walking through death. The grass was glazed over with a thick sheet of ice. The leaves on the trees had crystallized into tiny frozen sculptures. As I walked around the house towards the backyard, I felt little needles of ice forming on my eyelashes. It was in the backyard that I saw my father. He was standing solemnly next to a large pit. Had that always been there? I wondered. No, of course not. And yet, it didn't seem out of place. The pit took up the whole of the backyard, yawning deep into the earth. I crept closer and closer, keeping my eyes on my father's lonesome figure. He, too, was patterned with frost. The skin on his arms turned blue with the cold. I was only a few steps behind him when I cast my eyes into the deepest part of the pit. It looked blue at first, the light blue color that I hate even now. It took me a moment to match the blue in the pit to the blue on my father's skin, and to realize that skin was exactly what I was looking at. They were withering, their limbs snapping back and forth, their tongues lolling out of their mouths. Perhaps they would have moaned or screamed if they were able, but they weren't breathing somehow. I could sense that the air was too frozen to work its way into their lungs. There were no tears, no pleading, only the frozen dance of torment and torture to greet my senses. But the most terrible part was the sound. It filled the air. It was a crackling sound, the sound of their brittle limbs snapping with each and every jerk of their bodies. They ruined themselves, shards of skin crackling and flaking away with each motion. It sounded like the crackling of a great fire. At that moment, the moment of my greatest horror, my father sensed my presence. He turned around and stared at me. His eyes had gone cold as whatever surrounded us. He watched me as I opened my aching throat and screamed. The next thing I remember was my mother sitting next to my bed. She told me I had a terrible nightmare, poor thing, and had screamed in my sleep, which must have hurt my delicate throat. Indeed, it did. I don't remember ever being in so much pain in my life, but it didn't matter. As long as I was awake from that awful nightmare, I could relax, if only just a little. With time, I forgot the nightmare, or rather, stopped thinking about it. I don't think I can ever forget a sight that awful, but the image dulled over time, but that coldness always stayed imprinted on my mind. The farm was never a warm place again for me. The dream came back when my father had called me last night. His gruff voice was weaker than I remember, and I knew the sickness was taking a toll on him. Is that why I wasn't surprised by his demand? Perhaps I'd known all along. Perhaps it had taken only a little prodding to open my mind. Barbas, it's time to come home. I mustered a voice of confusion, although something inside me already seemed to understand. What are you talking about? I'm fading, and you know this. You can feel it. It's time to resume your duties. Remember the dream. Remember the ice, Barbas. And then everything fit together, and the world became whole, because I understood. Today, I am resigning from university. I will return to the farm to work in my father's company. He was, until recently, a very successful businessman, after all. And I will assume his post, which he will be vacating for me shortly. I tell you this, and I remind you, Dante was right. The ninth circle of hell is frozen. Perhaps I will be seeing you soon.